For the CREIA standards of practice and ASHI, the inspection is designed to inspect the primary living area and its primary parking area. Now, the guest house, of course, would be considered a primary living area as well. It would be unreasonable to think that the inspector is going to walk the entire, what'd you say, 9 acres?
3 acres.
3 acres?
Uh-huh.
Even 3 acres. Yeah, because the actual grounds, other than what is closely adjacent to the actual structures, are not part of the inspection. As a matter of fact, interestingly enough, property walls, fences, and gates, they're actually outside the scope of a property inspection.
Okay.
But obviously you want an inspector to observe and report. So if they do see something wrong with those things that are outside the scope, you would still, when choosing an inspector, want to make sure that they are offering that information as well. It's a structure, so it falls into the same category. If it's there, an inspector doesn't care if something is permitted or not permitted, right? Because they don't really know. Unless there's blatant signs that this thing's probably not permitted by the city, they don't know if this converted garage or this little, tiny house that was built next to this other house being used by, a guest or the mother-in-law or whatever. They have no idea if it's legitimate to be there. They're still going to inspect it in those 3 criteria: safety, functionability, at the end of its service life. This is a copy of the CREIA standards. This basically is the inspector's hat. Okay, this outlines what their job is, what they are to inspect and what they are not to inspect. When I say outside the scope, that would be in this section here, Part 3, limitations, exceptions, and exclusions. So there's many things that are excluded from a home inspection report or home inspection, and property walls, fences, and gates is one of those exclusions. But when I further say that in choosing an inspector, you truly want to find someone who's basically their first job, okay, or their importance, what they put their importance on, is to observe and report. So if there is something that's outside their scope, here's a great example, an oil well. What if there was an oil well in the backyard? I guarantee you there's not a property inspector outside of Texas who probably knows what an oil well is or really like how it works or whatnot. But minimally they would say there appears to be an oil well in the backyard. You should have it further evaluated by that appropriate specialist, because it's outside my scope. That's the communication that you minimally would want to hear from an inspector. Same as like property walls, fences, and gates. You got a wall that's leaning over. Maybe it's a retaining wall. Maybe it's just an aesthetic wall. The inspector could literally walk by it and just not have to say anything, and that's legit. But that's not what we want. We want somebody to say, hey, this is outside my scope. I don't know if it's structural. I don't know if it can be repaired, but I would suggest that you bring in a wall expert to further evaluate for you, because that is tangible information that the client can then do something with. That's what we're selling. We're actually selling information that the client can actually do something with, that gives them the ability to make an informed decision about that property, that house. The CREIA standards of practice were written along the same time as the California Civil Codes were written, when the laws and the standards for home inspection were being formulated back in the mid to later 90s, early 2000s. And then, of course, there's continued changes and updates and upgrades to all of them. The purpose of this inspection is to focus on the structures. It's not to focus on the property. Okay, in the true sense of the word, the acreage, the outer areas. It is the structures. It is the habitable areas. Okay. As a matter of fact, curious enough, you know what else is outside the scope of a CREIA standard?
What?
A swimming pool. A swimming pool. It's outside the scope. It's considered a ancillary, if you will, item. It's outside the scope. But that doesn't mean the inspector won't inspect it if they elect to inspect it. Anything that's outside the scope of the CREIA standards, the CREIA standards also allows, right, for the inspector to inspect that thing if they choose to. So the inspector can choose to inspect property walls, fences, and gates, choose to inspect pools and spas. We inspect, my company, La Rocca Inspections, inspects pools and spas because we choose to. Property walls, fences, and gates, we don't, because they're not something typically that is going to fall into the category of something that could be a significant defect. A leaning fence, as you even sort of pointed out, like, well, there's a fence. Typically is not going to fall into that category of a significant defect. Leaning fence, go get it fixed. It's a few $100, a few $1,000, whatever. We're not talking about a pool that's cracked on the bottom, leaking its water into the ground soil. You know, we're not talking about a foundation of a house that over time has sank at the back corner because of improper drainage. These are significant defects, okay, that the inspection is designed to find and call out. It was signed into law October of 2017, I believe, and actually implemented January of 2018. And basically what it is, it's Senate Bill 442 that is a new law that was signed, and it requires the home inspector to, it actually changed the definition of what is a home inspection. Civil Code 7195 had the definition of what is a home inspection and what is a home inspection report. And SB 442, when it passed, it actually added verbiage to the definition of a home inspection and its report to include a safety inspection of the pool and or spa, right? And that safety inspection would include listing or speaking to 7 different listed items that were listed, if you will, or codes from the California Health and Safety Code Administration and ASTM, the American Society for Testing and Materials. So now the home inspector actually has to, it's mandatory. If you have a pool and or a spa or a combination of those two, the home inspector is required now to actually go through and do an inspection of those items, looking at it from a safety viewpoint. So that's mandatory.
Specifically California?
Yes.
Okay.
But that doesn't include what the elected inspection would be of a mechanical or a systems inspection of the pool and spa. In other words, a mechanical inspection would be, we fire up the heater, we see if the pumps are working, we see if the electrical is correct, so forth and so on. So this is in addition to, or by itself if the client doesn't want the pool inspected. It's a little tricky. The curious thing about this law is that, from what I understand and from the way the law is written, is that nothing needs to be done. This is informational only. So in other words, the buyer, let's say there were 3 things that weren't in place, or let's say there was nothing in place. The buyer can request of the seller to do anything, but the seller is under no obligation to bring the pool and or spa safety systems up to any standard. So it's informational only for the buyer to then decide what they wish to do with after they purchase. If they're concerned that there's no fence around the pool, of course, they have 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds running around, they're going to put a fence around the pool. You know, but it is informational.